You would find the book of Acts, the 16th chapter. And by saying that, we're going to begin looking at the book of Philippians. But we're going to start in Acts. And there's a good reason for that. The letter that Paul wrote to the church in Philippi is where we're actually headed. And it is a wonderful letter. It's a prison letter. Paul writes it while he's in prison in Rome. And the occasion, and we'll talk more about it in the weeks to come, is that the church in Philippi has taken up an offering and they have sent it to Paul in the hands of Epaphroditus, because Paul, in his days in prison, you had to pay for your own upkeep. If you wanted to eat, you had to pay for it. Somebody in your family had to pay for it. And so they had sent him a gift. And so the letter of Philippians is a thank you letter, in which Paul basically sends it back to them in the city of Philippi saying, thanks for the money. Epaphroditus brought it. I'm doing good. And then he says a variety of things to them. So in the book of Acts is the account of Paul's time in the city of Philippi. And so I think it'll provide some pretty good background. Let me just tell you why we're doing this. Because of all of the churches that Paul writes to, Philippi is probably the best church. It's the most stable. There's not a lot of problems. There's not a lot of difficulties. And yet, he says to them, you can do better. He tells them ways that they can move on. And let me just tell you, I think we're blessed as a church. We've got good things going on. We could be better. And maybe this is one of those books that sort of challenges us to be good, but then to never be content, to say, God, we want to be better. And so the goal is, over the next few months, we're going to look at the book of Philippians and this city of Philippi and the people there. But I want us to visit the occasion in Acts chapter 16 where Paul is going to go to the city of Philippi. And so in Acts chapter 16, let me sort of set the tone for you. We're going to look at a couple of verses and then we'll go a little farther. But in Acts chapter 16, verse 9, and a vision appeared to Paul in the night. A man of Macedonia, by the way, that's northern Greece. That's the northern section of Greece, and that's the place where the city of Philippi is. A man of Macedonia was standing there urging him and saying, come over to Macedonia and help us. And when Paul had seen the vision, immediately we sought to go into Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. Now we're going to go a little bit farther, but I want to just sort of stop there a minute and start talking just a little bit about where we're going. At this time when this is happening, Paul is in Turkey. And he's there ministering, and he's on the second of his 3 missionary journeys. And he's spending time, and he's going to churches, and literally, Paul wants to go to the east. He wants to go someplace else. He doesn't really want to go to Greece. That's across the Aegean Sea. That's to the west. He's not really wanting to go there. He wants to go to Bithynia, and he tries to go to Bithynia. That's to the east. It's on over toward Russia. It's in that direction. He wants to go to what would be Eastern Europe. That's the direction he wants to go. And basically, he tries, and God won't let him. God just stops him and says, no, that's not where you're going. And then he kind of just sort of circles for a while, and he's hanging around in Asia Minor, and he doesn't. And then all of a sudden he has this vision. I want you to go not east, I want you to go west. I want you to cross the Aegean Sea. I want you to go to northern Greece. I want you to go to the area called Macedonia. That's where I want you to go. So they get ready to go. But the bottom line is, as this all plays out, that's not where Paul wants to go. God sends him someplace he doesn't want to go. He's not interested in there. He has a whole idea, and God says, nope, you're going to go someplace else. This is where you're going to go. And I don't know about you, but I kind of get the feeling as I read about Paul that he was just a little bit hard-headed. Just a little bit like some of you. And me too. But you know, kind of, this is what I want to do. And it's kind of like, God, this is my plan. This is the way I want to do it. This is the way. And I don't know that any of us are all that excited when God says no and kind of smacks you upside of the head and says, I don't care where you want to go. I got a better plan. Well, so he's going, and God says, no, you can't go to Bithynia. You got to go to Macedonia. Okay, so he goes there. He's getting ready. By the way, just to put this in perspective, Macedonia is in northern Greece. And the city of Philippi was originally had another name. Originally, it was called Crenides. It was a great Roman city by this time. There is the Ignatian Way was a road that goes from Rome all the way through Europe, all the way to the city of Philippi, and then on into the west or into the east. It's a big city. It's Roman influence. There was a huge Roman garrison there. It's in northern Greece. That's where they're going to go. He didn't really want to go there, but God said, that's where you got to go. The second thing to notice is that when he gets there, he ends up going to a place to pray. They didn't have a synagogue. There weren't enough Jews in the city, but there was a place of prayer outside the city. And remember, there was a vision of a man who said, come and help us. And so Paul, I know, is all excited that there's going to be a man there just waiting, and he gets up and there's a bunch of women. It's a women's prayer meeting. There aren't any men. Now, I don't want to be sexist about this, but you remember that Paul was a Pharisee. And in the Pharisee tradition, women were not allowed to speak in church. And because of the Pharisees, in the synagogues, men sat in the front, women sat in the back, if at all. Women were usually not allowed to read. They were not allowed to speak in church. There's a whole bunch of stuff in Corinthians about that. I mean, just to be honest, now, to give Paul credit, later on he is going to say, in Jesus Christ there's not any difference between men and women, Jew or Gentile. We're all the same in Jesus Christ. But it takes him a while to get there, and he was a Pharisee all of his life, and he shows up, and can you just see how excited? He's looking at his helper and looking around and saying, there's a bunch of women here. You know, it's kind of like, where are the guys? And so he's there, and so he's not where he wanted to go. He gets there, and it's not the people that he really is expecting, and he's looking at Silas and saying, is this what we came all the way over here for? And so he begins to meet him. Now, by the way, he does come across Lydia, who, by the way, is a seller of purple. And a seller of purple. Purple was a very expensive cloth to make. The dye was very expensive, and so it was kings and queens wore purple, hardly anybody else. So Lydia was probably fairly well-to-do. But he meets with the women, and so he talks with them. Then things just keep going swell in Philippi, in that he's on his way out to the city to meet with the women, and there is a slave girl who is an evil spirit in her, and she makes her master's money by telling fortunes and doing things, and she sees Paul and Silas and says out loud, large tones, behold, these are men of the Most High God. Listen to them, and begins following them all day, every day, shouting out all of these words behind us. Now, what she's saying is true. And by the way, evil spirits sometimes have to do what God tells them to do. And yet she's making all of this. And so he's trying to go about business. And this slave girl just keeps following and crying out and yelling out, servants of the Most High God. And finally, after a number of days, this gets old, and Paul turns around and casts the evil spirit out of her, which is great for her, but not great for her owners, because her owners were making money from what she was doing. So things get a little bit more challenging while all of this is going on, and they just say, we're really unhappy, and they take Paul and Silas and drag them to the city gates and into the center of town. And they bring the magistrates out, and they take all of their clothes, they strip them, and they begin to beat them. And it's a beating with rods. Now, we know from Roman punishment, this is a Roman colony now, so it's Roman magistrates, and this is not cat of nine tails, which was the whip with 9 pieces of leather and bits of bone and metal in it, but when they beat them with rods, they beat every part of the body. They would beat the arms and the hands and the feet and the legs and the stomach and the back and the head. And to be beaten with rods was terrible. So in the middle of the city of Philippi, where they've now been for just a matter of a few weeks, we think, they are being beaten with rods, and then they are taken and they are dragged to the innermost parts of the prison. The innermost parts are where you don't escape, where there's no light, whether it's dark, where all those things are going on. And they're brought in there and they are put in stocks. Their feet are put into wooden things with a lock on them, and so they're stuck, they're not comfortable, and they're there in the middle of the night. So, things are not going really well. And then on top of all of that, there is also an interesting piece in the Scripture that the word "we" starts showing up in the book of Acts. Now, the book of Acts is written by Luke. Luke, by profession, was a physician. And if you read through the Gospel or the book of Luke, or the book of Acts, all the way up to the verse that we're at, verse 10, the pronouns are all third person. I knew you were excited about an English test, or English, we won't test you on it, but what that means is, prior to this, Luke is writing the story as it was told to him. He's not there personally. So it's always, they did this, they did that, the apostles went here, Paul went here, Barnabas went here. It's always they, he's not with them. But here in verse 10, for the first time, the pronouns change to we. And from here on, if they're not telling a story that's something different, it's always we. So evidently, at this moment in his life, Paul needs the attention of a physician. You remember that he had a thorn in the flesh. Nobody really knows for sure about that, but it's almost certain that it had something to do with his eyes. You remember he had and saw the great light as a part of his salvation, and at least one point in his own hand, at the end of one of the letters, he says, "I'm writing this in my own hand. See what large letters I use." People who are blind or can't see write very large. And there's a suggestion, maybe, nobody knows for sure, that one of Paul's affliction was that his eyes were constantly somehow damaged or injured when he saw the light of Jesus Christ in his conversion experience. But whatever the case is, from this moment in the book of Acts, in the city of Philippi, from that moment, he has a physician who travels with him for the rest of his life. I've often wondered, as if they were sitting there in the prison in Philippi, if Silas didn't turn over to Paul and say, "Are you sure we were supposed to come here? Because things are not going really well. This is not going just terrific. We've been beaten, we've been bruised, nobody's listening to us except a bunch of women. This is not really going. Are you sure you got this one right?" And in that moment, there's all of these things that are happening. And then that brings us to pick up in verse 25. Things have not been going well. They've been beaten. Things have had kind of some negative situations. And now, about midnight, in verse 25, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God. That just seems a little strange by itself, doesn't it? And the prisoners were listening to them. And suddenly there was a great earthquake, so that the foundations of the prison were shaken. And immediately all the doors were opened, and everyone's bonds were unfastened. And when the jailer woke and saw that the prison doors were open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself. And by the way, that needs a little explanation. The position of being a Roman jailer was a big deal. You were a soldier and you rose, and this was a big promotion, but a part of the responsibility was you were literally, physically responsible for the prisoners. And if the prisoners escaped, you took their place. It's kind of an interesting little twist, but literally, if they had a 5-year sentence and you let them escape, you served their 5-year sentence. If they had a death sentence and you let them escape, you got the death sentence. They got paid really well, but there were some quirks and some challenges. And so the soldier, the jailer comes in, and he knows that if the doors are open and everybody is free and they escape, he has no life. So he pulls out his sword. He's ready to kill himself, supposing that the prisoners had escaped. But Paul cried with a loud voice, "Do not harm yourself, for we are all here." And the jailer called for lights. By the way, they're singing and they're doing all this praising in the dark. And they're in the innermost part of the prison, so it's really dark. They're singing, didn't have a hymn book to read, but they were singing and praising God. And he comes in trembling with fear, and he falls down before Paul and Silas. And then he brought them out and said, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" Now, almost certainly, he's thinking about, I don't want to be killed by my boss. I don't want my general or my magistrate to come in and put me to death. I know that's probably what he's asking, but Paul sees a great opening. You want to be saved? Have I got a salvation to talk to you about? And he says, believe in the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved, you and your household. One of those great words. And they spoke the word of the Lord to him and to all who were in his house. And he took them the same night, hour of the night, washed their wounds. He was baptized at once, he and all of his family, and he brought them into his house and set food before them. And he rejoiced along with his entire household that he had believed in God. And that's the story of what happens. This is a fabulous story. And this is the backdrop for the letter that Paul is going to write. It's a prison letter. Paul is writing it from prison. And it's kind of fascinating that as he's sitting in prison now, not sure what's going to happen to him. He's in possibly Mamertine prison in the city of Rome. He may have already at this point got to the place where he's able to provide his own rented house. Prisoners, political prisoners in Rome had to provide for themselves. So Paul is sitting in Rome. He's in prison. He's waiting for trial. He doesn't know what's going to happen. A friend, Epaphroditus comes from Philippi, brings some finances, some money to help, and Paul sets down to write a letter back to the church in Philippi, back to the Philippian jailer, back to Lydia, back to all the people that he met while he was there. And as he's doing that, he sets down and he's writing. And he's thinking about them. It's just a fabulous moment. And it sets the backdrop for the entire letter and some of the things that he's going to say. The words of encouragement, the words of affection, the words of appreciation that he is going to write in the letter that he writes to the Philippians is all set within this context of him sitting in prison and remembering those events. Now, he wasn't there very long. He was probably only there for maybe a few weeks, maybe a month or two at the most. And then after this whole scenario of the jailer and the Philippian jailer, he's going to say goodbye to the believers, to the women and Lydia and others, and then he's going to leave, and he's going to visit Philippi one more time for just a few short days on the third missionary journey. That's Acts chapter 20. But he's remembering this entire event. And now he's writing back to them, and this is the backdrop, these moments that they've shared. And some of it not very positive stuff. He shows up and Philippi doesn't turn out like he thinks it ought to be. But there's some good things for us to hear today. One of them is that circumstances do not have to define us. Without any question, as Paul is thinking about the circumstances, the events, the way things played out in Philippi, there's a lot of negative stuff. Oh yeah, we had a really great time in Philippi, got there, didn't really want to be there to begin with, but showed up, and then we got there, and all we could find was a bunch of women, and then after we talked to the women, then we got arrested, and then my eyes began to be a problem, maybe, and I had to have a doctor, and all of a sudden we're thrown in prison, and we've been beaten, and yeah, those were really good times. I mean, Paul is going to write back, and one of the first few things he's going to say in the letter that he writes to the church at Philippi is he's going to say, every time I remember you, I thank God. Now what's changed? The events of his time in Philippi are not just stellar, they're not thrilling, they're not exciting, they're not wonderful, but he says, every time I think about you, I thank God for every remembrance. It must suggest to us that circumstances and the circumstances we go through are not everything. That there's stuff more important than circumstances. There are things that happen to you and to me beyond our control. There are things that go on in this world, and we don't have to be defined by the stuff that happens to us. Our circumstances are not the end of who we are. The bottom line is that all of us have things that are done to us, things that happen to us that are beyond our control, that we cannot say are good, but that doesn't mean we still don't have joy. You know, one of the words that occurs in this letter that Paul writes called Philippians, the word joy and joyful and rejoice, it's like 11 or 12 times. It just shows up over and over and over. And what it says to us, that joy, real joy, the joy that comes from Jesus Christ, the joy that only God can give, has nothing to do with circumstances. The worst circumstances you can imagine were a part of Paul's journey to Philippi, and yet he still writes back and he says, man, every time I think about being there, God was so good, and His grace was so great, and His joy was so real. We need to be careful about living and allowing our hearts and our minds to be controlled only by circumstances. Now understand, circumstances can be good and bad. Stuff happens that you can't say is good stuff, but there's something beyond even our circumstances. Philippians, as we begin to walk through it, is a book about finding joy even when stuff that's going around your life is not very positive. There is no way you can see Paul's trip to Philippi was a fun vacation. It was not just a thrilling thing where he said, man, I'm really glad I got beaten and thrown in jail. I'm really glad I got there and who I wanted to work with didn't show up. I mean, there's none of that, and yet in the midst of that, Paul says, I have a joy, and he writes about joy over and over. Understand that we need to be careful that just because things have happened in our lives does not mean that we cannot find the joy of God. There are many of us who've had things that have happened in our life, maybe in the past, maybe in our childhood. There's no way that we can't look back on our life, and if we start looking, we can say, no, that was not a good thing. That was maybe even a tragic thing, and that was a sad thing, and that was a terrible thing, and that's something that I wish had never happened, and yet it's part of my life. But part of the story of Paul and Philippi is that no matter what may have happened in your past, that does not mean you cannot have a sense of contentment and joy and peace and the presence of God today. That God is in the business of helping us move beyond our pasts, and we do not need to be held by them. The second thing about that is that all of us have sometimes things that happen beyond our control. There's some stuff that's not really anybody's fault. It's not anybody else's fault. It's not our fault. Stuff just happens. We live in a sinful world. We live in a world where stuff happens that is not particularly good stuff, and there's not any way to get around it. People get sick. People have physical problems. People die quickly and unexpectedly. We live in a world filled with troubles. But even in the midst of a world filled with troubles that are not something somebody else did or even something that we've done, we still can find a sense of joy. That's one of the messages of the book of Philippians, that no matter what's going on, I can still have the joy of the Lord. But there's also an interesting part that suggests that even when you and I have done things that are foolish, and sometimes our lack of joy in the moment is because we've done stupid things. We've made choices, decisions that God is willing to forgive us, and yet some of us continue to hold on to those things and hold on to them and hold on to them. And at some point, one of the messages that we're going to look at as we go to Philippians is, no matter where the past is, no matter what other people have done to you, no matter what you have done yourself, that does not mean you cannot still know the joy and the peace of God today and tomorrow. One of the messages of Philippians is that circumstances do not have to define us. We're not saying they didn't happen. We're not saying bad things didn't go on. We're not saying we didn't do stupid things and foolish things and make mistakes. But a part of the message of the gospel, the good news, is that regardless of the past, today can be good because of the grace of Jesus Christ. The second message is that joy and contentment and happiness are choices. Circumstances do not have to keep you from being happy. You choose. Have you ever known anybody who chose to be unhappy? I mean, I know some folks. It's just kind of like, I don't care what's going on. They just choose. Pretty day out, yeah, but it's going to probably rain later. Well, I like those clothes. Yeah, they're old. I just wish I could get something new. I mean, it's like no matter what is going on, they have chosen to just be miserable. That's who they are. And frankly, aren't they kind of depressing to be around? And if you're married to one, I'm tough. I'm sorry. If you're married to somebody like that, you're just stuck. I don't know. There are people who I know folks and I visit them because I'm a pastor and I do it, but honestly, I don't like being around them because they're just so negative and so discouraged. But you understand that the book of Philippians is a book that reminds Paul's sitting here writing this, and he's saying, man, I just loved being with you, and I enjoyed, and he's so wonderful. And the stuff that happened there was really lousy. But he chose to see what was good. There's something about that joy and contentment and happiness are choices. And if you happen to be around somebody who chooses to be miserable, there may not be a lot you can do that except for you don't have to join them there. There are folks who are living in their own pity party and they've sent you an invitation. You don't have to join them. You need to choose to be joyful. You can do that. It's possible. The third thing is that joy, contentment are easier choices when we're with the right people. I think it's kind of good that God didn't throw Paul into jail by himself, but he had Silas along. I really wonder what they were talking about. I mean, they're bruised, they're bloody, they're beaten, they're sitting in the stocks, they're looking at each other, except it's dark now, it's midnight, and they can't really see each other. And I'm sure Silas saying, so you sure we were supposed to come to Philippi? You're positive? Yeah, I think so. Okay. And so before long, they're praising God and they're singing. And the worst event, the most tragic part of life that you and I all face, and life is filled with difficult times, is easier when we share it with somebody else. And God did not send Paul to jail by himself, but he sent him with Silas. And there's something good about being shared. And the truth is, one of the reasons for the body of Christ, one of the reasons for family, one of the reasons for Christian friendships, one of the reasons for Christian fellowship is that when you and I face difficult days, we don't face them alone. We have the grace of God, we have the Spirit of God, but we need one another. There's something powerful about simply being with each other. God created families so you don't have to go through the hard parts of life alone, and the joys of life are that much richer because you share them. And you may or may not have physical family that's that, but you certainly can have the family of God, the body of Christ. And one of the things about the book of Philippians, it's very much about the people of God being the kind of persons they need to be. And there's a kind of joy that we experience when we share life together. And on any given Sunday, people come to our church. And in various pews, there are people who, man, they've had a great week. And there are people who are really struggling. And circumstances are hard, and they've been beaten up at work. They've had challenges. There are family issues. There's health issues. There's things going on. And every Sunday we have people who come in here, and they just need to sit down next to somebody who just cares about them. They need to be in a Bible study class where there's somebody and they're sharing prayer requests, and people actually care and they listen and they really pray. We just need each other, and this becomes one of those places. There's something very special. And almost as you read and as we look at the book of Philippians, Paul is writing to this people, and they walked through terribly difficult moments in that place. He remembers the jail. He remembers getting beaten. He remembers all of those things. And yet he writes back with a kind of joy and love and a wonderful experience because they shared those together. And the bottom line is that faith in Christ is the key. There's no way you can read about Paul's events in Philippi in the book of Acts. It doesn't make sense. All of those things going on there, and then you get to the letter that he writes back. It's almost like it was two separate events. But Jesus Christ made the difference. So today, we're going to start this journey. And this was sort of the beginning. We needed to do Acts 16 before we went on and begin next week looking at Philippians chapter 1. And we're going to read the story, but this is going to be in the back of our minds. But today, I guess maybe a couple of things. One is, today you may be struggling. You may have had some tough events. This may be a challenging week. I know for some families there's been struggles, death, sicknesses, illnesses, things that are just hard in your family. I want to tell you that there is a kind of joy, there is a kind of strength, there is a kind of peace that comes even in the midst of those, but it's a function of our faith in Jesus Christ. And there's a strength that allows us to get through what may be very difficult, what may not look very easy today, and yet there is a strength that helps us to walk even through the fires of challenge and difficulty. And today, if you've not found that strength, that inner peace, that something that causes the Apostle Paul to look back on these crazy things that happened in the city of Philippi and yet write back with a joy and a peace and a love, then you've missed this extra piece of the presence of God. Well, we're going to look some more at this as we go. But today, when Paul thought about those events, the circumstances were not good, but the God who saw him through them was tremendous. Let's stand. Maybe some response or decision you need to make, and if that's the case, we invite you to come. Maybe you're walking through one of those difficult times and you just need to pray for some kind of strength, some kind of Spirit of God, some kind of peace to get you through. But whatever it is, let's stand.